future is by getting together today and working and combining our knowledge and working in a proactive fashion. I have to comment on Dr. Suzuki's speech. We were very, very fortunate in Walkerton to have him make a presentation to us in our time of need, and he came to Walkerton and spoke to, I think, about 800 people and raised $17,000 for our community, which we used to help with our participation in the inquiry. And that was of tremendous benefit because that allowed us to bring in some of the expert witnesses that we wouldn't have otherwise had access to get their input to find out exactly what had caused our tragedy and move forward. About a year after Dr. Suzuki was in town, I was being interviewed by the Korean media, which is a bit of a challenge, as you can might well imagine. And I was explaining about his presence in Walkerton and all the good work he had done for us. And the interviewer, who didn't speak very much English, just looked at me and said, "The Suzuki good." And that's what we need to take away. You don't need to say any more, the Suzuki good. You can see the picture of the Walkerton water tower, and that's probably one of the most photographed water towers that there are in the country. And when you think about it, as you travel your way through the rural parts of this country and you come up to a small town, the water tower is one of the first things that you're going to see. And that sign on the water tower proclaims the name of the town, and quite often, as in the case of Walkerton, "We'd love the pleasure of your company," is a welcome. That water tower should symbolize that this community is ready to welcome you and has a safe water supply to provide you with when you get there. Unfortunately, that is not so often the case, as we now know, tragically. Now, my daughter never likes me to go away and give these talks, and she tries to come up with almost any excuse that she can to get me to stay home. So this time she said to me, "But Dad, if you go away and talk, what happens if that big horrible hurricane comes up and gets us while you're gone?" And my son said, "Cassie, just do your homework and your mother will leave you alone." She's not here today, you might well have guessed. So from infamy to, or from anonymity, I should say, to excellence, Walkerton is not so very different from many, many communities across this country, and yet we found ourselves catapulted in a matter of a few weeks from absolute national obscurity to center stage for months at a time. As we all know all too well, in May of the year 2000, a deadly form of E. coli and a cocktail of other bacteria, including Campylobacter, which killed 2 of the people in our community, Salmonella, a number of parasites, and a number of viruses entered the municipal drinking water system in Walkerton. The result was the immediate or near immediate death over the few weeks of 7 people. Thousands of other people became ill, and I'm sad to tell you today that a number of those people, it has been determined, will never fully recover from those illnesses. So Walkerton, in a very, very short space of time, became the brand name for contaminated water. I don't know, probably because I'm more sensitive to it, but when I turn on the news, it seems almost on a weekly basis there's some environmental process that's underway or some looming disaster, and the sort of caption that's given to it by the local politician or environmental or political officials is, "We don't want to become another Walkerton." This is the tablet at the memorial in Walkerton that has been created in our water garden to honor those that suffered and died in the tragedy. No community should have to have a memorial like this. And what strikes me is, as our tragedy unfolded and we formed our group, one of the first communities to contact us was a lady from the Housing Division of Northern and Indian Affairs. And she expressed her sympathy to us, and she also expressed concern and empathy, but she said, "How is it that you are getting so much attention for this problem? We've had water difficulties for years and years and years, and no one seems to notice." And I said, "Sadly, I think you have to have a lot of people die at the same time before it even hits the radar screen." But since that time, I've heard of countless problems on First Nations communities, and I think it's clearly time that they hit the radar screen and action is taken. It's completely unacceptable the way it has been. When the Walkerton disaster occurred, I think the myth of Canada as this land of completely endless, pristine water was shattered forever. If we learned all we need to learn about water from the beer commercials, where they have the mountain stream flowing directly into the brewery, and it's this water that's fallen directly from heaven that's making this wonderful drink, you would think, surely in this country we have more water than we could ever pollute, and more water than we could ever use. I think we used to believe the same to be true about our fisheries and about our forests. And sadly, we found that that was not the case. So to suggest that shock was the first emotion to grip our community would be a gross understatement. We looked at it in the way that we look at the commercials on TV where they talk about getting wells and installing them in parts of the developing world. I think we had convinced ourselves that death and illness according to, or at the hands of contaminated water, was the only place we'd see that would be the most wretched parts of the world. It would be the developing world, impoverished world. This is absolutely not true, and I think if we look at the evidence that's presented at this conference and some of the reports in Dr. Steve Rudy's book, which I highly recommend, we'll see that contaminated water is an ongoing problem of affluent societies. Quite frankly, the environmental alarm clock had been ringing for some time, and the public and politicians alike kept rolling over and hitting the snooze bar, much to our peril in the future. I want to just give you a bit of a picture of Walkerton because I think it's important that when you hear that type of remark about Walkerton was this aberration, it was a one-off, it'll never happen again, we've dealt with that. Walkerton is more like your average town than you might think. But the media headlines would lead you to believe that there was something going on there that doesn't go on in communities all over. So I want to paint you a bit of a picture of Walkerton and then talk about some of the surreal juxtaposition of images that occurred during that time of crisis. Walkerton has a population of about 5,000 people. It's been that way. I started dating my wife in 1979. It was that population then. It hasn't changed much at all. It's the seat of Bruce County, so we have local government there. And it's known for its beautiful beaches because we straddle the Lake Huron shoreline and then up into the Bruce Peninsula and down the other side of the peninsula into Georgian Bay. And we're also known for our great deal of agriculture and the nuclear power plant, which supplies much of Ontario's power. Now, my daughter is still under the impression that Bruce County was named after me, and I'm not dispelling that notion quite yet because it gives me some power in the house, but not a lot. Bruce County has a population of about 60,000 people, and there are no cities in Bruce County. I think our largest community would be about 7,500, somewhere in that area. But we have an animal equivalent to human population of well over 1 million. In fact, I've heard it quoted as high as 1.6 million. Now think about that in context for a minute. We don't have 4 cities in Canada that have 1.6 million people. And as one of my colleagues who is fighting a large-scale hog operation that was scheduled to open just adjacent to his property, he said to his wife, "We have new neighbors moving in." He said, "Oh, that's nice. Do they have children?" Yes, they plan to have 3,000 of them. They weigh 300 to 400 pounds each, and they have no toilet. This is a genuine threat to our continued existence as we know it. This is a look at Walkerton from the air, taken just a couple of weeks ago. You can see it's a beautiful little community, well-treed. That's the Saugeen River meandering through. And I don't think you can quite see just by the bridge at the bottom of is their cultural center, also known as Tim Hortons. So shortly after, or prior to the May long weekend in Walkerton, we had what they referred to as a 100-year rain event. And this took on epic proportions where you really thought that the entire community was going to flood right up out of the Saugeen Valley. I remember it because my daughter's birthday was the next day and we were preparing for that. My wife couldn't go to the adjacent town because there was so much water coming down. They closed the Zellers for fear that the roof might collapse under the weight. Downtown Walkerton, within a matter of very few hours, flooded about 8 inches deep, and the local park was flooded so that cars were submerged right up to the tops of their doors. I remember opening the garage door in my house and watching sheets of rain hit the roof so rapidly that the eaves troughs couldn't channel it away fast enough, and it spilled off the edge of the roof. At one point, I actually thought that there had been a water main break because I saw in the side of my lawn water shooting up about 2 or 3 feet in the air, and I realized that what that actually was the downspout from my eaves trough running into a drainage tile and then shooting up out of the water. So absolutely a tremendous rain event, and that set in motion the Walkerton tragedy. Within a few days after that, reports of illness started to pour in. The stores, the drugstores literally sold out of diarrhea medication, and cases of bloody diarrhea were reported, and right to the point of full-blown E. coli, which and a few cases ended up in the hospital and in the regional health center in Owen Sound. The doctors there were perplexed because usually when you have E. coli outbreaks, it's related to a food-borne contamination. So the search began to find out where is this coming from. And what happened was that the officials at the health unit were looking and trying to find out in Walkerton by asking questions of local officials and local community organizers, was there some event where all these people could have acquired this contamination in their system? And what they found was that the age range was right from very, very tiny children to a number of people who were in the nursing home. So based on the fact that there was no common place where all these people could have consumed this food, by the Sunday of that week, they proactively initiated a boil water order, drawing the only conclusion that was left to them, that this must be in the water. And frankly, we dodged a big bullet in Walkerton, as bad as it was, on the, I believe, the Friday of the long weekend in the nursing home when they came down with a number of cases of diarrhea. They proactively, prior to the calling of the boil water order, put their people on bottled water. If that hadn't been the case, we might have had 100 dead because those folks are already in a compromised position with their health. So on the long weekend on the Sunday, there was an announcement on the radio, and this is something that every community needs to think about. If you are issuing a boil water order, how do you reach the people? On a long weekend, half the people in Walkerton are out of town. My family were. We came back on the Monday, some 30 hours after the declaration of the order, to find no notification on our door, and had it not been for friends of ours that popped into the driveway at the same time we did and said, they say there's something wrong with the water, we would have continued to drink it. If you have a situation like that, and I'll speak about it a little bit later on, you've got to take it in hand. This is not a trivial matter whatsoever. So on the Tuesday after the holiday Monday, the schools were open. My kindergarten teacher, or my wife's cohort and my daughter's kindergarten teacher told me of how she spent the entire school day dealing with young children in kindergarten who could not control their bowels and were just messing themselves all over, and she was calling their parents where they were available and sending them home. It was chaos. By the Wednesday, they closed the schools, and this is where some of the most bizarre things started to occur in Walkerton. The schools were closed. The children that were terribly sick were hospitalized. Those that were not critical were asked to remain in their homes because the order went out from the hospital, the message that we have no room for you in the hospital and we have no treatment. You'll have to deal with it on your own. So people weren't even visiting their doctors at that point. They were just suffering in their own homes. A number of the children who had relatives outside the area of contamination were sent away to stay with those relatives because it's very, very difficult to deal with children when you are fearing that they're going to turn on a tap if they're very young and drink as they normally would, even in the backyard, which could they run up to the water tap and make a mud pie and possibly risk their life in that way. So a lot of them were sent away. The children who remained stayed cloistered in their homes because you didn't want to, in those early days, let your child play with other children for fear of cross-contamination or secondary contamination. So on the most beautiful spring days, weather with the sun shining, the birds singing, there were no children on the streets, and that is the most eerie thing you will ever see. Streets devoid of children, it seems like some sort of violation, but they just simply weren't there. So you compare that image of the barren streets and you juxtapose it against our local hospital. And there's a picture of an air ambulance landing at the hospital, as it did far too many times. The hospital in Walkerton typically would have 4 to 5 patients in the emergency room waiting. I've been there many times, and usually you're in and out in about a half an hour. That should be the selling feature of any town. During the crisis, the waiting room was filled to capacity and then some. There might have been 40, 50, 60, even 100 people, and you have never seen anything like that in your life, and I hope you never do. Adults sitting in chairs, struggling to hold themselves erect in their chair as the pain, which is incredible, of the E. coli ripped through their abdominal cavities. It's like drinking gasoline and having it snake through your guts. And then the looks on the parents holding their small children. By this time, people had died. And you've never seen the color washed out of the face of an adult like someone holding a child and wondering, is my child going to die? Are they going to be next? The hospital was so busy that a team of experts was brought up from London Health Sciences, which is about 2 hours away, and there was so much call for evacuation of the ill that the air ambulance was stationed in Walkerton permanently for weeks at a time. You'd lie in bed at night and you'd hear this helicopter flying in, because it doesn't just drop out of the sky to the hospital. It would circle the town to get a sense of the wind direction and then land. And you'd be lying there and you'd be woken up by this sound of the helicopter, and you'd think, who's next? Who's dying, or who's going to be on dialysis, or what's going to happen? Today, if you talk to people in Walkerton, they will tell you that when they hear the sound of a helicopter, it catapults them emotionally back to that time, wrenches their guts. Sometimes they break out in a cold sweat, and sometimes they're reduced to tears just by that emotional scarring. So if you take that image and then juxtapose it with Walkerton's downtown, and this was a typical scene. This was outside one of our churches after a funeral. But the streets of our tiny main, or the sides of our tiny main street were lined with media. 50, 60 media trucks from every network you can describe, and a few you've never heard of. Satellite trucks, hundreds of reporters and technicians. They would scramble at night to file their stories, and the hardest thing they had to do was to try and take a shot that didn't have someone else's logo in the background. And you might think, well, people would just avoid that chaos, but you couldn't, because you see, our post office is right on the main street, and we don't get door-to-door delivery. So going to the post office is virtually a daily routine. It absolutely terrified people to have to walk through that gauntlet of that kind of attention. Most people that live in Walkerton live there because it's a quiet community where they don't have to deal with some of the things that go with large cities. Every night they would see the tragedy of their town played out on the local media, on the national media, and the international media. Since we formed the group, I think I've been interviewed more times than I could count. Sometimes when a major event would occur in Walkerton, it would be 40 or 50 times in one day. A little difficult to go on with your regular life when that's happening, but so crucial that that message get out, and we would stand up for what we needed. About a week after the tragedy, the then Premier of Ontario, Premier Harris, came to Walkerton and met with our mayor for about an hour. And after that, he came out, and we had hopes that he was going to come out and announce an inquiry, and he was going to announce a state of emergency for the town of Walkerton. But no state of emergency was declared, even though, and I will speak more about this later, we fit absolutely every criteria you can think of for declaration of a state of emergency. Instead, he turned to the media, not to the people, and tended to blame the former government of 6 years before for some of its changes, and in fact the town of Walkerton for incorrectly assuming that they had not applied for an infrastructure grant, which in fact they actually had done. And I think the point for me that was absolutely pivotal in turning me from someone who was being victimized to this to someone who wanted to take up action happened about 10 days after the tragedy. By this point, you were led to believe that you had dodged the bullet if you had not become critically ill. The incubation period for the E. coli was, in our minds, over, and if you'd got this far, you'd made it. But I found myself standing in my backyard, holding my 10-year-old son, well, he was 9 at the time, and he was weeping helplessly because he was watching that same air ambulance take away his best friend. And through his tears, he said, "Dad, is he going to die?" And I think I did what every father would do at that point. I said, "No, he's going where they have good hospitals and good doctors and good equipment, and we're going to pray for him." But he was absolutely torn apart, as we all were, and still, as you can see, get when we recall that moment. And I didn't sleep much that night, and I didn't sleep much for nights after that, because I realized that that little boy lived across the street from us, and the day before, he had spent the entire day playing in my basement with my children. And if it could take him, now he did not die, let me not leave you hanging. He has recovered, but we don't know what the future holds. But if it could take him and render him in less than a day in critical condition, it could take my children. And if there's one thing you don't do to a parent, you don't threaten their children's lives and then walk away like nothing's happened. Two questions plagued the minds of the people of Walkerton at this time. How could this have happened? I could use stronger words, and we did. But how could this have happened? And what do we have to do to ensure that this never happens again to anyone? Because, quite frankly, it is just too horrible. And from that, the seeds of the concerned Walkerton citizens began to grow. I got together with a number of people in our community, some I didn't even know before this time. In fact, I didn't know the chairman of our committee at that time. I wrote a letter with some other people, and I took it around to different people that I knew and some that I didn't, and I said, will you sign this? We have to get the Premier of the province to immediately conduct a full public inquiry, or call a full public inquiry into this disaster, so we can answer those questions that we so desperately need answers to. And if you ever have a disaster and you need to have an inquiry, you can make the same mistake we did, where you accidentally send it to the leaders of the opposition and to all the media outlets and let them have a look at it as well before you wait for your answer from the province. Over time, we were granted that full inquiry, and the concerned Walkerton citizens had full standing in all parts of that inquiry, which was absolutely crucial, because if you just allow the people that are the players in the tragedy to have their say, they will spend their time blaming each other for the tragedy. We knew that we would stand as the citizens of record in Walkerton for this. And we were very ably represented throughout this process by Paul Muldoon, and who you'll hear from on Thursday, and the Canadian Environmental Association, who went well above the call of duty to ensure that the inquiry found the answers. In fact, through them, we submitted what became the terms of reference for the inquiry, and Justice O'Connor saw a good thing and said, yes, this is what we need to look at. But what we found was that the needs of the community far exceeded just the needs of an inquiry. We had people who were battling serious health problems, so we initiated 2 different health studies. One the government has taken over, and one I'll talk about a little later, which we are still running today. There were issues of compensation. When you think about it, you have a community that is devastated. People are sick, businesses are closed, other communities and other people who are doing their shopping are avoiding your town like the plague. You have the issue of water distribution. You tend to think of water as something you go to the tap, you turn it on, it's there. But during the time of the crisis, you were told not to drink that. And the town and the province were treating pure water as a 9-to-5 situation. What if you have a child that's still sick and is throwing up uncontrollably and is having diarrhea uncontrollably in your home, and you have no water? We got a call from a gentleman at about 9 o'clock at night saying, my children are being sick, both of them had to be surgically attended to eventually. I have no water left. Are you going to go and use that same contaminated water to deal with the problem? The town simply didn't get that at the time. We brought in people to talk about stress management issues. We talked, we dealt with the politicians of the day, with liaison and also media liaison. And as I look back at that time, again, it seems very surreal. I'm a massage therapist by trade, and my appointment book for one day, I flipped through it just after the tragedy, and it had Mrs. Jones, an appointment at 9 o'clock. The Walkerton Herald-Times at 10 o'clock, which is the local paper. The New York Times at 11 o'clock, and Dalton McGuinty, the leader of the opposition at the time, at 1 o'clock. But that's the type of attention and need there was to deal with this situation. The town basically went into hiding. The concerned Walkerton citizens published the list and distributed the list of emergency numbers for people to call, not the town and not the province. So I want to talk a little bit about what happened in Walkerton, because I think in a lot of cases people have never got beyond the headlines. They've heard about some individuals that were highlighted who may have acted completely inappropriately, and in our minds we tend to do this. We say, you know what, somebody was killed hang gliding yesterday, but I don't have to worry about that because I'll never do that. Well, guess what? We all drink water, so we got to worry about it. And I think that even during this time of struggle, there were attempts by the government that did not particularly care for our opposition to their handling of the situation, and they tried to portray the concerned Walkerton citizens as a special interest group. So we said, okay, yes, we are a special interest group. We're that group of people that like to drink water and still live. There's a lot of us, so they better get used to it. So let's look at what caused the Walkerton disaster, and you'll hear many takes on this, and Paul is going to talk a little bit about it. But I'll just give you a quick run through. If we look at the Walkerton disaster, we see that it was a complete and utter systemic breakdown. There was no single decisive factor, but the synergy of all those factors that led to this. So let's start with the zoning and placement of well number 5, the now infamous well number 5. You see a shot of it from the air there, and the arrow on the screen points to where it is. What you're looking at is the public utilities yard in Walkerton. Those are sheds that the PUC would deal with, and they would deal with the water supply and the electrical supply. The well actually sits at the end of a built-up dirt road. There are actively fed and running springs that run just beside the well on either side of that road, and just beyond that little grove of trees is actively farmed land. It looks bigger than it is in real life. That's probably about 25 to 30 feet away. You can see that there's also a school bus parked on the edge of the picture in the bottom, and there's a school bus storage yard there. This is a shot from the ground before the well was actually torn down, and you can see just past the edge of those barrels was where the actively farmed land would be. There was no buffer zone surrounding the well at all. And this well was put into service prior to its approval from the government. And when it was finally approved, the certificate of approval stated that the land surrounding the well should be taken out of agricultural production. For 25 years, or a little over 20, pardon me, no level of government ever saw to that zoning change. So it was happily farmed. The gentleman who was farming the land at the time of the tragedy did not even know that that well existed. So there was no buffer zone, and during times of high rain, this well, you can't see it in this shot because this is in a drier time, but it's actually sitting in what is virtually a swampy area. And the sound of water being on the pump house floor being sucked back down into that pump could be heard. We also see chemicals stored right next to the well. What they were, I'm not sure. So we have a well in the wrong place, and we have nobody doing anything about it. Well, what about the maintenance of the well? Well, in 1990, a memo was sent to the Walkerton Town Council saying this well hasn't seen attention in 10 years. There are 3 separate well maintenance and drilling companies that are suggesting we pull the pump off the well and the chlorinator, put a submersible camera down the shaft of the well to examine the integrity of that shaft. What they did was, and they had about $30,000 to use for well maintenance, they didn't want to spend it. They pulled the pump off, and the local officials inspected the integrity of the shaft from the surface with the naked eye. Now, I would suggest to you that that's about as effective as going to your doctor and he says, you know, you're getting to that age, we really need to do a fiber optic scope and examination of your colon. You go home and moon your neighbor and ask him how things look and think that's good enough. It's simply not going to cut it, but that's literally what they did. So what about operator training? Well, in Walkerton, the 2 key men involved in the operation of Well 5 spent 90% of their time working on the electrical system and not the water system. They had no formal training in the care and provision of drinking water. They were raised on farms where they had drunk unchlorinated water for their entire lives, and quite frankly saw the addition of chlorine to the water as cumbersome and the regulations burdensome, and the only thing they ever heard about chlorine, and this is common in small towns everywhere, let's turn it down, it's bothering people, we won't use it. And so they routinely would falsify the records in Walkerton. What they would do is they would falsify the location from which a sample was taken. Instead of taking samples around the distribution system, as is the accepted practice, they would quite often take them all from one location just adjacent to the well and mark it as if it had been taken in other places. They would also falsify the chlorine residual in the water, marking it either as 0.5 or 7.5. This obvious fraud went undetected at that level for 20 years because they did not make the connection between their actions and what the outcome could be. And I think there's a very, very important point here. You don't have to intend harm to do harm. And that's something that we have to get through to people. It doesn't mean you mean to do harm for it to occur. So what about the Public Utilities Commission? Certainly the gentleman in the town that would oversee these gentlemen would step on this and say, look, you can't do that. You've got to take better care of the wells. You can't leave a chlorinator unattached for 6 months off a well. It's just not done. Well, at Public Utilities Commission meetings, water quantity was discussed. Water quality was never discussed. The gentlemen who were the commissioners were the mayor who sat on the commission, and 2 locally elected officials that did the job for a very, very low little stipend that they received on an annual basis. The gentleman who went on to become the Public Utilities Commissioner at the time of the crisis, when I returned to Walkerton in 1987, sold me a pair of pants, converted my license back to Ontario from Nova Scotia, and rented me an apartment. These are not water experts. They had no knowledge of the current legislation regarding Walkerton's or Ontario's water at the time, and there was no law that demanded that they be acquainted with these. Quite frankly, it was the blind leading the blind. So what about the Ministry of Environment? Surely the Ministry of Environment would be able to detect what was going on there. Unfortunately, again, this simply was not the case. The Ministry of Environment office that was responsible for Walkerton sat about an hour away in Owen Sound. They had some 11 areas of environmental responsibility under their care. Drinking water was one of them, and they had a number of municipalities for which they were responsible. It meant that they could spend less than 1% of their time on Walkerton's drinking water. So when you're an hour away and you have 1% of your time, it means phone calls as opposed to visits. And their role was not clear either in how the water was to be cared for. One of their officials testified during the inquiry that he was unaware of the fact that E. coli in drinking water could cause serious illness or death. The local health unit, again, was severely overstretched with a number of duties, and again, public health has come up time and time again as an underfunded area that is underappreciated, and the preventative nature of their actions are rarely ever seen in the light in which they should be as absolute necessities. Even though the local health unit knew that there had been past outbreaks of E. coli in Walkerton, the data that they had was not in a form that allowed them to relate it to the water in a way that let them take action. During the weekend in crisis, when they were searching for the answers as to where this contamination was coming from, they attempted to get a chlorine residual out of Walkerton water, and they were reduced to doing that with a backyard pool test kit, which they had to test at the actual local swimming pool to see if the thing was reading, because they could get no residual whatsoever. Private laboratories by this time had taken over the testing of municipal water in Ontario. Back in '95, there was a cost-saving measure to close the laboratories in Ontario that were public and privatize them. And initially this worked well, because the lab that took over the Walkerton system and was doing our testing was made up of individuals that had come from the public system, and they maintained the protocol that upon finding an adverse sample, they would contact the municipality's Public Utilities Commission or the town office. They would also contact the health unit and the Ministry of Environment. The idea being that between these three different groups, that preventative or remedial action could be taken immediately. But unfortunately, when you privatize a service, there is no guarantee that the entrepreneurs that step up to fill the need are going to continue to do that. So for whatever economic priorities that they had that didn't fit with Walkerton's plans, they withdrew that service. Then another lab stepped up to take on Walkerton's water testing, and this lab, to the best of my knowledge, had no microbiologist on staff. And when they found adverse samples of E. coli, and in Ontario the guideline or the rule is that 1 is unacceptable. 1 E. coli is unacceptable, 0 is acceptable. When they found levels exceeding that right off the scale, we're talking hundreds of E. coli per milliliter, lethal drinking water. They did not phone the Ministry of Environment. They did not phone the Ministry of Health. They simply faxed this information that if you drink the water, you could die, with no analysis, to the town of Walkerton, where it arrived on the desk of the man who had been falsifying samples for about 20 years, and we are led to believe it sat there for 3 to 4 days while we continued to drink the water in complete ignorance. The scary part about this is that that laboratory, under the legislation of that time, was not acquainted with the guidelines for Ontario's drinking water or the standards. They didn't have to be. They were not compelled by law at that time to reveal that information to anyone but the source that had paid for it. That means the Ministry of Environment and Health did not get this information. Their rationale was, this is proprietary business information. The fact that people could die is proprietary business information and for the eyes only of the person who's ordered the test. Again, another opportunity to stop this tragedy was missed. There was water main construction underway in Walkerton at the time of the tragedy, and a new water main had just been constructed. It was tested. There was E. coli present in this water main. It was not the cause of the tragedy, but they did not inform the authorities of this finding of E. coli in the new line because they assumed that it was not open to the system. In fact, it was. Again, another opportunity was missed to stop this. One of the officials or people working for the Public Utilities Commission who had worked in other locations and was not at all happy with the way Walkerton was conducting itself with water became very concerned during this long weekend. And rather than confront his boss about why he was madly flushing chlorine through the system, he phoned Spills Action in Ontario. And basically, a young man who was a summer student who was working there for the weekend did his very best to find out if something was terribly wrong in Walkerton. And after a myriad of phone calls and trying to get through to the right person, his call went through to Stan Cable and asked Stan if things were all right. The call went back to the same man again who had been falsifying the samples for 20 years. Again, no action is taken. The government of Ontario received, prior to this tragedy, 11 separate warnings about the perils, potential perils of their actions, from credible sources like the Ministry of Health itself, one of their own ministers, the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, the Chief Medical Officer of Ontario, and ironically, the town of Walkerton itself had written to the Premier to say, we are not comfortable with the closure of the public laboratories. We don't know what we're going to do for testing, and we are not happy with that. Those warnings were all ignored for the sake of cost savings and reductions in costs to the Ministry of Environment. Voluntary compliance was the order of the day in Walkerton, or in Ontario at the time, which simply put meant that we are going to ask municipalities to comply with standards, but we are not going to force them. The Ministry of Environment was aware of the fact that Walkerton was out of compliance with the standards for testing year after year after year. They would write to them, they would phone them, promises were made to comply, they never did. When one of their officials, their abatement officers I believe, wanted to move formally against Walkerton and order them in a public way to comply, she was overruled by her superior who said, we don't do it that way, it's voluntary compliance. The people of Walkerton remained unaware that their municipal system was not meeting standards and that they were at risk. Voluntary compliance, especially with people who are unaware of the significance of the protocols and the actions that they must take, simply do not work. It's not a workable system. When you have rules that you have to follow on the electrical side that are hard and fast, and airy-fairy, we'd like you to do it, but we're not going to make you on the other side and the water side, it doesn't happen. I've yet to enter a town where you see a speed limit that says suggested speed limit. It's pretty hard and fast. Justice O'Connor entered into an examination of risk management with regard to the government's cutbacks during the time of the crisis and before it. And the government spoke about the fact that it had undertaken risk management, looking at what their cuts would do and would they, in fact, lead us down the road where harm may come to people because of their cutbacks. And while the government commented on risk management, Justice O'Connor could find no evidence that risk management had actually been undertaken. The government presented not one single document looking at risk management at the Walkerton inquiry, and when the Premier himself and other ministers took the stand, never once did they mention anything to do with risk management. It simply wasn't done. We basically in Ontario traded in an environmental protection plan for the environment for an environmental business plan. Simply not acceptable. So I hope you can see when you look at that systemic breakdown, again, you don't have to do harm, mean to cause harm to do harm, and no single person in the chain of events from the lowest man on the totem pole to the Premier's office thought that their actions would be pivotal in causing this disaster, but in fact they were. We have to step back and take the big look at this. I want to talk very briefly about body mapping. And body mapping is the second health study that we've undertaken in Walkerton. It's a community-driven initiative, originated in Scandinavia, I believe in Sweden. And what it's designed to do is to look at the health of people in that instance in the workplace, in an industrial workplace. And this was brought to Canada by a group of people at the Sarnia Occupational Health and Safety Clinic. And what you in fact do, and they used it there to look at people working in not a refinery but a foundry who had been exposed to asbestos, is you take the individuals that are willing to be part of your study and you give them an extensive questionnaire to fill out, and they will anecdotally tell you about the changes in their health. They're allowed to comment in writing, they're allowed to tell you where they've had changes, and when we used it in Walkerton, we were the first case where this has been used in a community-wide basis, not just an industrial setting. And in our case, we used it to chronicle the health changes since the contamination of the water in our community. What you see here is part of one of the case histories, and this is a map of the human body. I would use this very same map. If you came in for a massage appointment, I'd sit down and take a case history from you, and then we would mark points on the body where you had discomfort or problems of that nature. So in this case, you can see that there are some points on the person's head and into their arms and shoulders. It's a little difficult to see, but there's some triangles on the wrists. And these indicate changes in the person's health. It might be a condition, a dysfunction, something like that, since they consumed the water. What we found was, of our 165 participants, they averaged about 20 points of dysfunction or pain each. So after you've gathered all that information, our coordinator would then take that information and chart it of all the participants and take the aggregate of that and put it onto one single body map. And you can see by the size of the door off to the side of the picture that these are full-size replications of outlines of the human body. And what you can see with the colored dots is those colored dots, and the clarity is not great enough to see, but each one of them has a number on it related to the number of the person that participated in the study. And what starts to happen is you see clumps of illness forming. You can see a clump around the midsection that would indicate kidney problems. You can see on the back when it looks more like a terrible rash on the back of the person's rear end, that's diarrhea. You can see the long sort of Freddy Krueger fingernails. That's arthritic problems in the fingers. You can see it also in the feet and in the knees and throughout many portions of the body. The blue part that looks like a bizarre hat on the head of the individual is actually a collection of auditory problems with hearing that people are having, vision problems, respiratory problems, circulatory problems. What we found was a range of illness that goes well beyond what you would expect from E. coli, which we've been led to believe would just be bowel problems and kidney problems. A tremendous range of illness, and also we were looking at insomnia, chronic fatigue syndrome, many, many things. And what we're looking at this point is we're not suggesting that the water has caused all of this. This is just simply at phase 1 a collection of data. Now, one of the explanations for this that it was given to me by a gastroenterologist who's looking at taking this further with study is that the pores in the bowel are designed to operate selectively to open at certain times and allow nutrients to pass into the body. He told me that they should also be closed at other times, and he's feeling that these pores are not closing when they should, and then that barrier that's meant to keep disease from penetrating into your body is not closing properly, and that multiple organ systems can be attacked because, again, we're not just talking about E. coli, we're talking about a cocktail of toxins coming into your body, Campylobacter, Salmonella, the parasites, the viruses. And so the criticism that we found with the body mapping experience is that people will say, you know what, wait a minute, these people are in the middle of a lawsuit, of course they're going to say they're really sick, of course they're going to find everything that ever happened to them and list it on their list of complaints. There are two things that would suggest that that is not the case. One being, after 3 years of this hell that people have gone through, to get people to even participate in a study is very, very difficult. Only those that are really suffering will. And then what they found in the Sanya experience, where they did body mapping on the foundry workers, that didn't just affect the foundry workers, but they took the asbestos home in their clothing and it affected their loved ones as well. They took the anecdotal information and charted it. Then later, they followed that up with a look at the health of these individuals using traditional scientific methods of probing disease processes. They found what people reported anecdotally and what actually happened in the community with those people was almost identical. So it seems that it is a very, very good indicator of illness. Phase 2 of the body mapping will, when we get some funding to look at it, will look at the linkages between the consumption of contaminated water and the illnesses present in the community. And then phase 3 will look at getting appropriate treatment for these people and perhaps lifestyle counseling. What we're finding at this point is that people are dealing most successfully with this by using naturopathic medicine, eliminating certain foods and things like that. There is no nirvana out there, but this is a good start. I want to talk very briefly about emergency preparedness because this will happen again in some community in some form. There was no state of emergency declared, as I'd said, even though we fit every parameter for it. I think it's important in future that when a community finds itself in a critical situation like this, that we have clearly defined rules for going into a state of emergency, and that not be at the discretion of local officials and provincial officials who may be implicated in the actual tragedy that they're looking to investigate. We cannot have that. We've got to get to it right away. Regardless of planning, these events will happen, unfortunately, in some communities, and we have to be prepared. In Walkerton, I can give you an example of what didn't happen. A month into the tragedy, when we're all still going for bottled water, and you can see that's our arena, completely filled to capacity on the ice surface with case after case of water that was distributed by volunteers. I arrived on a day in July, and it was probably about 29 degrees in the shade, very, very humid. An elderly couple pulled up next to my car. The gentleman said to me he was looking for his family. His wife said, "Don't mind him, he has Alzheimer's." She got out of the car. She was tiny and frail. And the volunteers looking at this lady and her husband said, "You know, we can deliver this water." She didn't seem to twig to that information or understand it. So I said, "Put it in my car, I'll follow them home, and I'll deliver it for them." I was honking my horn as I was following their car because the gentleman's door kept flying open. He'd forgotten to close it, and I was afraid he was going to fall out. When we pulled up at their residence, which was an apartment that was 3 stories high with no elevator, the elderly lady got out of her car and looked for the cases of water that had been loaded into my car in her trunk 3 times. This family, this couple, were supposed to, in this high humidity in their 80s, carry this water up 3 flights of stairs. They had not been identified at being at risk. They were not able to cope with the situation, and under the provisions of an emergency, you would go door to door and assess your community and say, who can deal with the provision or the rigors of this, and who needs help? Wasn't done. We could have had more deaths and tragedies, and I can't stand here today and tell you that somebody didn't die lifting Walkerton water at the time when they shouldn't have been. Completely unacceptable. I want to just roll in together 2 ideas here, pipelines and source protection, and they don't go together normally, but I think there's reasons why they should. Walkerton is looking at new water sourcing for the future, and the options that were put on the table were a new well field, which we are using right now, the river that flows through Walkerton, Hanover, which is an adjacent town about 10 kilometers away, and pipelines running to the Great Lakes. The shortest one would be a distance of probably about 60 kilometers. The other would be a distance of about 100 kilometers. Even in Walkerton, where we died and suffered and had people fall ill from using groundwater, 85% of the people resoundingly came back and said, let's take care of our groundwater and not pollute it and make sure it's safe for us and our children to drink. And you know, that is a very, very strong statement coming out of a community that's gone through what we've gone through. When you look at pipelines, I am so worried about them being used in situations where it's not necessary. They are costly to construct. The estimate to build the pipeline for Walkerton and some of the other communities would be in the order of $60 million. If they tell you $60 million, can you count on 120? It would involve running this pipeline into very, very small villages and putting people who are economically impoverished onto this system forcefully at a cost of connection of a few $1,000s and a few $1,000s more a year when their own water is still actually not bad at all. Pipelines are not drought-proof. A couple of years ago when we had a drought in Walkerton, there were some people saying, well, you know, if we only had a pipeline, we could have as much water as we want. I said, really? Is it raining over the lake more than we've noticed? It's just not an answer in that way. Pipelines often spawn inappropriate development. They're like a railway coming to a small town. Development follows the pipeline. You want to put in a huge factory that's water intensive? We got a pipeline. You want to put in a huge hog barn? We got a pipeline. You can do it. Pipelines tend to undermine in the minds of people the need for active source protection. If the thought is prevalent in your mind that we can do whatever we want to the groundwater here because we get our water from over there, you're wrong. In Walkerton, people looked at the Saugeen River and said, no, we don't want to drink from that, we're not confident in it. But yet, there are engineers pushing the fact that we should have a pipeline leading from the lake that the river dumps into. There's a logic gap there that I'm just not seeing. So I'm not suggesting that they are inappropriate in every case, but I think that they have the potential to seriously undermine our protection in the future. Quickly, the cost of getting it wrong. Well, the community's reputation was absolutely shattered, as you can well imagine. How many people, when they think of Walkerton, think of the fact that the Saugeen River flows through it and it's great for fishing and swimming and canoeing? I don't think that's the first thought. What about the fact that we placed second in the Community in Blooms competition a couple years ago that doesn't just look at flower gardens but looks at the environmental health of a community? That doesn't come to mind. We know what comes to mind. Psychological experts have suggested that 15% of our population has suffered and may still suffer post-traumatic stress syndrome from the Walkerton disaster. That can lead to symptoms of sleeplessness, pain, inappropriate dysfunctional behavior, all kinds of physical symptoms that people don't attribute usually to that kind of event, but they are there and they're present. The loss of business. When you're 10 miles away from a town that's bigger than you and you have bad water, where do you think people go to shop? If they develop those habits, some of them never return. Walkerton pays, according to our mayor, about 3 times the average cost for municipal insurance that an average town would be. That may never change, and it's a heck of a burden to your municipal financing. The MOE, Ministry of Environment, saved some $40 million in cuts they made before the tragedy. The cost of the Walkerton tragedy, a town of 5,000 people, is conservatively estimated to cost $150 million, and we still don't know where the end of that is. Ongoing illness in the community is tremendous. One of the local doctors is suggesting that the kidneys are going to be acting up on a lot of people. We have about 100 people headed down the road to diabetes and dialysis as we speak. One of the ladies that I spoke to whose kidneys are leaking protein has been told by her doctor if she consumes more than 1.5 liters of liquid a day, try cutting your lawn and doing a few other activities and not drinking more than that, her kidneys will leak protein and she will be on the road to very, very serious health problems. The cost of that is going to be absolutely astronomical. What is the future health of our children? We have absolutely no idea at this time. So from infamy to excellence, we have to learn the lessons from Walkerton. The work of defending our water will never end. The E. coli that killed people in Walkerton didn't exist 25 years ago. We're building larger industrial operations all the time with chemicals. We have no idea of their output on human health or their impact. We are building larger agricultural operations. We are living where we've never lived before and seeking water. We can't sit back and think we did source protection 10 years ago, it's over. We've got to adequately fund source protection. We've got to have our people properly trained. And I think most important, we have to involve the public. When we involve the public, make them aware of the information and the necessity to protect our water, then we can actually take action because the politicians will be interested. If the voters say, you better protect this, then they'll take an interest. We can't burden our children with poor water stewardship as a legacy into the future. It's just not worth it. These are my children at the time of the tragedy, but they could be anybody's children. I value their lives, as I'm sure all of you value your children, and you don't want anything to happen to them. My daughter feared water exclusively for about 2 years and had nightmares about it. A 6-year-old should not have to worry about her next drinking glass of water being her last. She should worry about crossing the street and looking both ways. My son was 12 last year. His foot began to swell. They told him at the hospital and my wife that it was a uric acid buildup, and it was actually the symptoms of gout. They said they have never seen that in a 12-year-old before. My wife suffers chronic irritable bowel syndrome with no abatement, and in fact, it's getting worse. I've experienced arthritic symptoms and bowel symptoms that are at this point unexplained, and my family is one of the minor cases compared to what exists in our community. We cannot take this lightly. We've got to work together proactively. Our children are going to face many, many challenges in the future. Let's work together to ensure that toxic drinking water is not one of them. Thank you for your time.